Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 17 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format between weeks 8 through 16 in order to give ourselves the most overall perspective as to who has the advantageous matchups that we may want to go after and specifically play those wide receivers based on those given matchups. After we talk about that, we'll then transition to our top 36 wide receiver rankings as I'll share with you guys my perspective and opinions and the statistics that justify my reasoning as to how I think the wide receiver position is going to stack up when it's all said and done at the end of week 17. And many of us are taking home our 2021 fantasy football championships. Now, before we begin today's video, let me remind you, again, this channel is making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 season going until week 18 and even beyond that, talking about the NFL playoffs, playing in NFL playoff fantasy leagues. For those of you who haven't played in those, I would absolutely suggest you do so. And where to do that? Well, you can do that via Underdog Fantasy. If you guys haven't checked them out already, you can go ahead and sign up today using promo code Andrew. And Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Again, the NFL playoffs and playing in a fantasy best ball league or even playing weekly contests, playing pick'ems, there's a variety of ways in order to get your fix of fantasy football even after the season is done. So go ahead, check out Underdog Fantasy and use promo code Andrew today because that's what we'll be doing for majority of this offseason. All right, now that we've covered all that, let's go ahead and let's start talking about the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. Again, like I've mentioned, we wanted to go ahead and condense the overall matchups based on the last 8 to 9 weeks of the season in order to give ourselves more of a perspective, because I don't really care what a defense did from weeks 1 through 7. Truly, sure, there could be a couple performances that were defining, but overall, the defenses that have kind of played over the last 2 months of the season really define what we're going to see in the upcoming weeks, and specifically in Championship Sunday matchups. So I wanted to go ahead, condense it as such, as we typically do, and show you guys statistics as to how many points these respective defenses have been giving up to opposing wide receivers. As you can see on screen, the Minnesota Vikings still maintain the number one spot in terms of giving up the most points on a weekly basis to opposing wide receivers last week. Of course, Cooper, Kupp, and Odell Beckham Jr. both found a lot of success against that defense. The Baltimore Ravens most recently gave up a ton of points to T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd, and that entire Cincinnati Bengals offense. The Atlanta Falcons, of course, all season long have been giving up a bunch of points, followed by the Arizona Cardinals, who earlier this season were amongst one of the better secondaries, but as of late, that has truly been their weakness. I'm sure the Dallas Cowboys wide receivers will be able to take advantage of that, followed by the Houston Texans. Those are some of the top 5 matchups. And of course, as we see, the thing that kind of pulls it all together for those teams is the fact that they're giving up a boatload of touchdowns. Touchdowns are the biggest difference maker. And as long as your wide receivers have the opportunity to get that 6-point influx, whether it is in a standard, half PPR, full PPR league, it'll give you that much more of a greater upside to winning this upcoming weekend's matchup. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, of course, the Philadelphia Eagles, who have been one of the better defenses, specifically in the secondary, Darius Slay has definitely terrorized some wide receivers as late, specifically Terry McLaurin, and you'll have the opportunity to take him on once again. Terry McLaurin is definitely in a tough position, followed with, of course, Jacksonville Jaguars wide receivers. None of them have been consistent at all this season. Of course, they've dealt with injuries. They've dealt with the inconsistency of their rookie first-round, overall pick quarterback, Trevor Lawrence, and whatever the heck is going on with the Jaguars, they're going to be in trouble. The Buffalo Bills. They'll have, of course, the wide receiver core of the Atlanta Falcons on hand. Outside of Russell Gage, there's not much value there, and hopefully he'll be able to still muster up a great performance despite the fact that he has a tough matchup. Either way, go ahead and take these stacks as you will. You can pause it, filter through it. Either way, we'll refer back to these statistics as we progress through the video. Just wanted to go ahead and show you that for week 17. Let's go ahead and transition to our top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 17 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Let me go ahead and remind you once again, rankings are subject to change. Yes, there are going to be a multitude of injuries that as the week progresses, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday practice will indicate whether or not a player is going to be ready to go. And once, in fact, we are given all that information by Saturday, you can go ahead, stop by Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kickoff with Kirchhoff. I live stream here every Sunday morning answering your questions. I have live up-to-date rankings on screen so that you can get your questions answered, whether it is my top 36 running backs, wide receivers, top 16 quarterbacks, and tight ends up to date, ready to go. to help you out and help you win a 2021 Fantasy Football Championship. So go ahead and stop on by for those of you who are interested. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into this, shall we? Beginning with our top 12 at the position. We begin with Cooper Kupp, wide receiver of the Los Angeles Rams. He takes on the Baltimore Ravens. Again, this is the second week in a row where he has an extremely easy matchup. Last week took on the Minnesota Vikings. Yes, he was only able to put up 100 overall yards and 10 receptions, but when I say only, that just kind of gives you an idea as to how great Cooper Kupp has been and what we kind of expect. This is a man that is averaging like 24 fantasy points per game and a half, PPR scoring format. As of his performance thus far this season, in the 15 games that he has played, he has already put up more fantasy points than any other wide receiver in the last decade of football. In only 15 games in a half PPR scoring format. That is just an unbelievable number. Of course, we're talking about performances like Davante Adams last year where he had 18 total touchdowns. 2019, the performance in which Michael Thomas broke the record for the most receptions in NFL history in a singular season, the record that was previously set by Marvin Harrison of the Indianapolis Colts. We've seen a lot of incredible performances out of Calvin Johnson. We've seen great performances out of Antonio Brown with the Pittsburgh Steelers, but Cooper Kupp is just, he reigns supreme over all of them. He'll continue to break records and hopefully win us a championship this year. Of course, you're starting him. Moving on, Davante Adams takes on the Minnesota Vikings. Similar to Aaron Jones, like we talked about yesterday, the Green Bay Packers find a lot of success against this Minnesota Vikings defense. But I think of all the Green Bay Packers that have played against this defense over the last couple years, Davante Adams finds himself the most success on a consistent basis. In fact, in the last couple games that he's played against them, in fact, the last 3 games, he has averaged 29.47 half PPR fantasy points per game. He has scored 7 touchdowns in the last 3 contests against the Minnesota Vikings defense. Besides the fact that he's putting up consistent performances, again, coming off of a 28-point fantasy week, he has been the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy in terms of fantasy points per game scored since week 11. He has scored 7 touchdowns in the last 5 games, and he's an unstoppable force against the easiest matchup of the wide receiver position. He's going to have himself a great game and win you a championship. Moving on, Justin Jefferson on number 3 on the other side of that matchup. Justin Jefferson found a lot of success against the Green Bay Packers earlier this season in week 11, in which he had 8 catches, 169, and 2 receiving touchdowns for 33.2 fantasy points. But let's take into account the fact that Jair Alexander was not active for that game, and he has been activated from the injured reserve from his shoulder injury to come back and play this week. Now, I don't know if he's going to have a full opportunity to cover Justin Jefferson, but if in fact he's going to be able to do so, that may make it a little bit more difficult for Justin Jefferson to find extreme upside, but I still think he's going to find extreme success. And let me tell you why. With Adam Thielen having season-ending surgery on his ankle, there has been a couple performances in the last 2 seasons in which we've seen Justin Jefferson perform without Adam Thielen in the lineup. In those 3 contests, overall, it has just completely been a one-man show. It has always gone to Justin Jefferson getting his, ample amount of targets and scoring touchdowns. That has been the case. In those 3 contests, 38 targets, 4 touchdowns, and average 17.4 fantasy points per game. I think this is going to be a very easy week for Justin Jefferson. Hopefully, Jair Alexander doesn't lock him up too much, and he's able to have himself a great fantasy performance. Moving on to Deebo Samuel, our thumbnail for today's video, taking on the Houston Texans, the 5th easiest matchup at the wide receiver position. And like we talk about, they're one of the easiest matchups on the ground in terms of giving up points to opposing running backs via rushing touchdowns and rushing yards. Specifically, that matters because Deebo Samuel is a rushing machine. As of the last couple weeks here, he's been averaging 10.65 fantasy points per game just off of rushing statistics alone. In terms of his rushing statistics in the last 6 games, 38 attempts for 279 yards and 6 rushing touchdowns. That kind of stat line is just unbelievable for any running back, much less a receiver that is adding that on top of his receiving work. Like last week, he had himself 9 catches for 159 against the Tennessee Titans secondary. With Trey Lance at the quarterback position most likely starting this week, I still think that this is a great opportunity for Deebo Samuel to have himself a great performance. Earlier this year, in the 2 games in which he played with Trey Lance at quarterback, he was able to get himself in one of them 8 targets, 4 catches, 107, and 2 touchdowns for 24.8 fantasy points. And in the other game against the Arizona Cardinals, had himself 9 targets, 3 catches, 58, no touchdown, but was able to get himself a rushing attempt and a rushing touchdown for 14.6 fantasy points. Overall, he has found success, and yes, the rookie quarterback is going to be inaccurate. The targets aren't going to always lead to receptions, but I still think he's going to be the number 1 in this offense going into this week. Moving on to Stefon Diggs, taking on the Atlanta Falcons, the third easiest matchup at the position. It is just incredible how all the best wide receivers are getting these easier matchups going into their final week. I mean, it really does set us up for a lot of success. Now, of course, Stefon Diggs is coming off of a second consecutive week in which he's faced a very difficult secondary and put together great fantasy point performances. Again, he took on the Carolina Panthers a couple weeks back. Against Stephon Gilmore, was able to find himself in the end zone. This last week, J.C. Jackson, one of the better cornerbacks in the National Football League, was able to find himself 7 catches, 85, and a touchdown. 18 fantasy points is no joke, but he's been able to do this on a weekly basis since week 6. In fact, since week 6, he's been averaging 15.03 half PPR fantasy points per game, in which he has scored 8 touchdowns in the last 10 games. As long as he continues to find himself the opportunity, the success will always follow for Stefon Diggs. Moving on to Tyreek Hill. We talk about this a lot, and we've mentioned this a couple times this season already in regards to Tyreek Hill and the success he finds typically after a poor performance. Now, we all know that Tyreek Hill, coming off of the virus IR list, was going to be not 100%, but we didn't expect him to not play very much. He was exhausted out there, according to Patrick Mahomes. He only played 42% of the offensive snaps, but I think going into this week, he should be at a full capacity. Unfortunately, for many of us who had Tyreek Hill, maybe we're not in the championship because of that 2.9 fantasy point performance. But for those of you who somehow managed, you're going to have yourself a pretty good performance on hand here, because this season already, when Tyreek Hill puts forth a performance of less than 10 fantasy points, he has turned around the following week and has averaged 21.85 fantasy points per game in those following weeks after a less than 10-point performance. So I expect a huge game out of a player like Tyreek Hill, and hopefully he'll be able to dominate. Moving on to A.J. Brown, who came off of an unbelievable week last week against the San Francisco 49ers. Josh Norman really had no chance in stopping him and his overall potential. But my goodness, that second half Tennessee Titans team completely looked different from what they were producing in the first half. And luckily, they were able to get A.J. Brown the ball as many times as they did. He had himself 16 targets and 11 catches. That's a career high in both categories in terms of his overall 3 years of his career thus far. But when you give this man opportunity, I've always mentioned it, he is just a completely different wide receiver. He has touchdown upside. He's a strong guy, and he has unbelievable speed. Throughout his career thus far, looking at the last 2 seasons with Ryan Tannehill at the quarterback position, when he's been given 9 or more targets, he's averaged 13.85 fantasy points per game. When he's been given 10 or more targets in a game, he averages 16.83 fantasy points per game. That kind of opportunity going in his direction, my goodness, I think A.J. Brown, regardless of the fact that he takes on the Miami Dolphins, is in a fantastic position. With Julio Jones potentially going to miss this week once again, A.J. Brown's the only option for this offense. Moving on to Antonio Brown. Now, Antonio Brown has the privilege of taking on the New York Jets defense this week, giving up the 11th most points to opposing wide receivers. The thing that I wanted to mention, obviously we're starting Antonio Brown, especially considering there's probably going to be no Mike Evans. Of course, we know Chris Godwin out for the rest of the season with that ACL injury. Leonard Fournette on the injured reserve, he's going to be missing. So in terms of receiving options, with Rob Gronkowski, Scotty Miller, and even Tyler Johnson, all of them being underutilized last week, it leads me to believe that Antonio Brown's probably going to continue to have 12 to 15 targets here on forth until we get some of those other receiving options and running backs back into this lineup. I mean, 15 targets, 10 receptions, 101 yards against Stephon Gilmore is no joke with your first week back. The thing that I wanted to mention is, of course, this has been what Antonio Brown's been able to produce over the last 2 years. We've seen this consistency. And I mean, in the last 3 games, he's averaged 20.93 half PPR fantasy points per game. So all he has to do is really accompany his performance with a touchdown this week to make it even that much better. And of course, he'll lead us to a championship. Moving on to T. Higgins, our number 9. Now, I understand T. Higgins coming off of a 37.4 point performance. He did a lot, right? He carried our teams. And you may be thinking, Andrew, why is he only at number 9? He's not going to be able to put up another 37-point game. That's once in a lifetime kind of numbers. Really, it is, especially at the wide receiver position. 12 catches, 194, 2 touchdowns. Maybe he'll do it again next year against the Baltimore Ravens as they just continue to find themselves a lot of success against their division rival. But nonetheless, T. Higgins has shown this kind of excellence over the last couple weeks. Obviously not at this capacity where he's scoring 2 touchdowns, but at least he's been able to get himself over 100 receiving yards in 4 out of the last 5 games that he has played. I mean, not only that, in the last couple weeks here, in the last 5 games, he's been the number 2 overall wide receiver in fantasy, and he's been averaging 19.86 fantasy points per game. Of course, that consistency, regardless of the fact that you take on the Kansas City Chiefs, is something that deserves to be acknowledged. and respected as such, and that is why he sits as our number 9 this week, because yes, there are possibilities that other receivers in this offense will take away some opportunity from him, but as long as he continues to ball out, he'll be in our lineups. Moving on, we have Jaylen Waddle as our number 10, the guy that is probably going to break the rookie record for most receptions in a season, Anquan Bolden's record set many years ago, but Jaylen Waddle has been insane. I mean, in the last 4 games, these are his stats overall: 42 targets, 36 receptions, 384 receiving yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns. That's 74.5 half PPR fantasy points, which makes it an 18.63 fantasy point per game average over the last month of the season. Jaylen Waddle has been incredible, and as soon as you implemented him back into the offense, bye-bye Devontae Parker. He completely disappeared, wasn't even targeted once on Monday night against the New Orleans Saints. And that wasn't just because Marshawn Lattimore was on him, because Marshawn Lattimore was covering, Jaylen Waddle for a lot of that game and still wasn't able to keep up with this talented young wide receiver. They have the privilege of taking on the Tennessee Titans' 7th easiest matchup of the position. And as long as Tua continues to look towards his number 1 wide receiver's direction, of course, they're going to continue to find success and score a lot of points together. Moving on to Keenan Allen on number 11. Unfortunately, Keenan Allen had a little bit of that slump game, and I'm not going to think that that's something that is going to continue. I think Keenan Allen is top tier at the wide receiver position and will continue to put together great performances, regardless of what we saw last week against the Houston Texans. And overall, across the board, outside of Justin Jackson, everybody performed under their overall potential from the Los Angeles Chargers. A lot of players were missing, and there were a lot of exterior factors that definitely kind of impeded Keenan Allen from having himself a greater performance. But I think going into this week against the Denver Broncos, he should be perfectly fine. He'll most likely be taking on the slot corner, Callahan, who has given up 226 receiving yards in the last 5 weeks to opposing wide receivers in man-to-man coverage. As long as we're in a situation where Keenan Allen's going to have the opportunity, which he predominantly saw from weeks 8 through 15, and unfortunately wasn't given that similar opportunity last week. But from weeks 8 through 15, the guy was getting 10.85 targets per game, 7.6 receptions per game, 84 receiving yards per game, average 0.57 receiving touchdowns per game, which is all encompassing 15.9 half PPR points per game, which we really are expecting to see once again this week. Keenan Allen should be fantastic for the Chargers offense. Moving on, we have Ja'Marr Chase, the other half of the Cincinnati Bengals receiving core. Again, Ja'Marr Chase has been one of the more inconsistent wide receivers in the second half of the season in comparison to the first half. But what established Ja'Marr Chase early in the season was the fact that T. Higgins went down with an injury and Ja'Marr Chase was scoring in bunches. A lot of touchdowns. In fact, there are only 2 other wide receivers this season that have over 1,000 receiving yards and 10 receiving touchdowns. The other 2 wide receivers besides Ja'Marr Chase that are in that current conversation are Cooper Kupp and Davante Adams. Pretty good company to be mentioned with. Either way, I think Ja'Marr Chase, a fantastic option going into this week. This offense continues to hum. As long as Joe Burrow is letting it loose, Ja'Marr Chase, T. Higgins both will be able to succeed and find themselves a great fantasy point total this week. Let's move on to the wide receiver 2 conversation, beginning with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, I know that there's a conversation as to whether or not Jared Goff is going to play, but let's be honest, even without Jared Goff last week, Amon-Ra St. Brown was insane. 11 targets, 9 catches, 91 yards and a touchdown, 21.5 fantasy points with Tim Boyle as the starting quarterback of this team. Since TJ Hawkinson has gone down with his injury, in the last 4 weeks, Amon-Ra St. Brown is the number 4 overall wide receiver in fantasy. He's averaging 11.5 targets, 8.75 receptions, 85 receiving yards, and 0.75 touchdowns per game. That's 18.03 fantasy points per game as of the last month of the season. So regardless of who's at the quarterback position, whether it be Goff, I know he's dealing with a knee injury, whether it be Tim Boyle, this man is going to find success. They take on the Seattle Seahawks this week, which is one of the tougher matchups at the position. But when we're talking about a receiver like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who plays majority of his snaps from the slot position, in fact, this season has played 77.8% of his snaps from the slot position. He takes on the Seattle Seahawks. A couple weeks ago, we saw another one of these stud slot wide receivers by the name of Cooper Kupp go for 9 catches, 136, and 2 touchdowns against that defense. Why not Amon-Ra St. Brown continue the consistency into week 17? Moving on to Brandin Cooks. Now, I particularly thought Brandin Cooks was going to be incredible last week. Unfortunately, did not have the opportunity to play because he was on the virus IR list. Going into this week, he has the San Francisco 49ers. It is the 6th easiest matchup at the position for a reason. We just saw Josh Norman get completely annihilated by A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown by himself, 16 targets, 11 catches, over 100 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, carried his team to a victory. And why not, potentially have that case with Brandin Cooks, considering Davis Mills really does like to target him when they're the only 1-2 combo in this offense. Now, as of late, when we're talking about Brandin Cooks and his overall potential, In the last 3 games with Davis Mills as a starting quarterback, he's had 27 targets that have led to 21 receptions, 286 receiving yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns. That's 19.03 fantasy points per game. On top of the fact that not only did A.J. Brown have himself an incredible 145 yards and a touchdown this last week, we saw Russell Gage the week prior, 8 catches, 91 and a touchdown. T. Higgins for 114 yards, while Jamar Chase 2 touchdowns and 77 yards. Tyler Lockett 7 catches, 68 and a touchdown. Adam Thielen 5 catches, 62 and 2 touchdowns. The San Francisco 49ers, they've certainly been in trouble as of late, and I think Brandin Cooks will be able to take advantage of that this week. Moving on, Diontae Johnson. Now, listen, Diontae Johnson has always been in this top 12 conversation, but in 3 out of the last 4 weeks, he has had less than 10 total targets. And when we talk about the differential between Diontae with and without 10 total targets is a pretty big difference maker. Now, I understand this is a man that has been averaging 14.23 fantasy points per game this season already. And I honestly expect him to pretty much be in that class. He'll probably put up 13 to 14 points, and that's all we need. And with, Big Ben Roethlisberger taking on the Cleveland Browns, yes, it's one of the tougher matchups, but hopefully in his final home game of his career, in Heinz Stadium, he can go ahead, throw the ball to his number 1 receiving option, his favorite receiving option in this offense, and get him reestablished and utilized with 10 plus targets. Because if he's not able to meet that, of course, his overall upside is going to be a little bit limited. But either way, I think Diontae Johnson, a fantastic play against Cleveland this week. I'm not too worried about his overall potential. Moving on, we have DJ Moore as our number 16. DJ Moore, speaking of a receiver that has found success in specific matchups, taking on the New Orleans Saints, giving up the 9th most points to opposing wide receivers. In the last 4 games that DJ Moore has participated against the New Orleans Saints, he has averaged 20.55 fantasy points per game. He has been absolutely nuclear against that secondary. We've talked about it earlier in the season. Like Marshawn Lattimore is, unbelievable against Mike Evans. He locks him down every time they play. But on this other end of the spectrum, when DJ Moore takes on Marshawn Lattimore, he completely torches him and just makes him look like a scrub. And that's been the case. DJ Moore has established that, and hopefully we'll be able to get back to his successful form. This week, they have already announced that Sam Darnold's going to be the starting quarterback. Earlier this season in week 2, they both combined for 8 catches, 79 yards, and a touchdown for 17.9 fantasy points against the New Orleans Saints. So why not again this week? Moving on to CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper. I thought I wanted to go ahead and talk about both of the Dallas Cowboys wide receivers in a singular conversation, because the matchup on hand here is incredible. But I don't know who's going to score the touchdown. And that's really been the biggest difference maker. There's been so much inconsistency at the Dallas Cowboys wide receiver position as of late that it is tough to go ahead and establish and say definitively that this wide receiver over the other is going to be better. Because oftentimes we'll see Michael Gallup be given the red zone opportunities. We'll see Dalton Schultz steal some. We'll see, of course, Zeke, like last week, score 2 touchdowns down in the red zone, while CeeDee Lamb at times will be inconsistent and not get those kind of upside performances, while Amari Cooper will have himself a great game, then disappear the next week. There's a lot of inconsistency, but considering the fact that the Arizona Cardinals have been awful in terms of their secondary, I think this gives a really good chance for both of these wide receivers, CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper, to succeed. Specifically, let's talk about recent performances. As of late, they have given up a boatload of touchdowns in the last 3 games that they have played. Of course, against the Indianapolis Colts this last week, T.Y. Hilton, 51 yards on 4 catches and a touchdown. Michael Pittman, 8 catches, 82. Of course, another wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts scored in that contest, but he doesn't matter. Moving on, Josh Reynolds had himself 6 catches, 68 and a touchdown. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 8 catches, 90 and a touchdown. Cooper Kupp, 13 catches, 123 and a touchdown. Van Jefferson, 2 catches, 58 and a touchdown. OBJ, 6 catches, 77 and a touchdown. The fact they have given at least 2 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers in each of the last 3 games gives me so much confidence in the fact that both these wide receivers can score touchdowns. And if they're able to, they can get themselves into this top 12 conversation, but they need to have that touchdown in order to get there. Moving on, we have Hunter Renfrow at number 19. Hunter Renfrow, similar to the conversation that I just had about Diontae Johnson, it's a matter of consistency, and this man has been consistent all season long, but especially as of late with Darren Waller out. From weeks 9 through 16, he's averaged 13.09 fantasy points per game. Of course, coming off of another great performance in which he scored a touchdown, but of course wasn't given that much opportunity. 3 targets, 3 receptions, made the most of it, scored a touchdown, 11.5 fantasy points. But is that going to be a defining number? As a wide receiver 2 option, he's perfect because he'll get the points that we certainly need him to get. And whether it is upside week or not, at least we're consistent enough to hope that Hunter Renfrow is going to meet his 10-point average and move on with that. And I'm confident with the idea that I can go ahead and rely upon Hunter Renfrow regardless of who they're playing against. This upcoming week, the Las Vegas Raiders, they take on the Indianapolis Colts. This will make it a little bit more difficult for these outside receivers like Zay Jones, Bryan Edwards returning, Deshaun Jackson to succeed. And of course, if the running game gets stopped, Hunter Renfrow should have himself a great performance here. Moving on to Odell Beckham Jr., our number 20. In 4 out of the last 5 games, this man has scored a touchdown. That is an unbelievable statistic. I mean, just coming into the Los Angeles Rams organization, it has been a completely different OBJ that we have continued to see on a weekly basis continue to improve. As he gets more and more comfortable, as a rapport continues to be built with Matthew Stafford, they're on the right track. The fact that they take on the second easiest matchup of the wide receiver position just continues to lead to his overall opportunity and upside. I mean, we saw Higgins, Boyd, and Ja'Marr Chase all have incredible performances. Higgins, 192 and 2 touchdowns. Chase, over 125 receiving yards. And, Tyler Boyd, like he typically does, goes for a 50-plus yard receiving touchdown. Had himself 85 and 1. The week prior, Davante Adams, MVS, both found the end zone. Both found themselves a lot of opportunity. Diontae Johnson, a couple weeks back, 105 yards on 8 catches and 2 touchdowns. I mean, there have been 11 wide receivers in the last couple weeks, specifically since week 11, that have had 80 or more receiving yards against this defense. That's 11 wide receivers since week 11. That in itself continues to make me think that the Baltimore Ravens defense and their secondary is in trouble. And that's why OBJ should have himself a great week here. Moving on to Tyler Lockett. Look, I think Tyler Lockett's a great option. And on top of the fact, let's talk about DK Metcalf. But my only issue, and the reason why I have Tyler Lockett a little bit lower than I typically would on a weekly basis, considering, again, he's coming off of 2 performances as of late in weeks 14 and 15, in which he put up 12 total receptions, 210 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. That's 19.5 fantasy points per game in those 2 weeks. The unfortunate reality is that we may have another weather game here on our hands for the Seattle Seahawks. And DK Metcalf, he was able to fight through it, put up 11 points, find himself in the end zone, but both these guys did not have much opportunity. Tyler Lockett, 6 targets, 3 catches. DK Metcalf, 5 targets, 2 catches. If we are in another situation where it's a rain game or a snow game, then it's going to be all Rashad Penny all week long for the Seattle Seahawks taking on a defense like the Detroit Lions, who are very bad in terms of stopping the run. So if we're in a scenario in which it is going to be a weather game, then I would pivot away from these players, but I'll preemptively have them as our number 21 and number 22, just for if in fact this is not going to be a weather game, just to kind of give you an idea that yes, I want to play these receivers because we do have the opportunity of playing them against the Detroit Lions secondary, which is an advantageous matchup in my opinion. So overall, we'll kind of keep an eye on it, but for right now, if it is going to be a weather game, we might have to look elsewhere at the wide receiver position. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr. Now this is another one of these preemptive. Let me go ahead and preface, I don't know if Carson Wentz is going to play. Carson Wentz is currently on the virus IR. They just recently changed the protocol that you have to be isolated for 5 days. If that is going to be the case and Carson Wentz can get cleared and play Sunday morning against the Las Vegas Raiders, then by all means, I think Michael Pittman Jr. is very easily a top 24 wide receiver option coming off of a week in which he had 12 targets, 8 catches, 82 yards, 12.5 fantasy points. If he puts a touchdown on that resume, then, he's a 20-point, play in a given week, and we'll take that. But the unfortunate nature is that maybe he doesn't have Carson Wentz under center. And if we're going to have Ellinger as a starting quarterback of the Indianapolis Colts, then I don't trust any receiving options in this offense. I would just pretty much expect them to run the ball the entire game and hope that Jonathan Taylor can dig them out of any scenario they're in. So for right now, if it's Carson Wentz, he's good to go. Otherwise, we got to look elsewhere. Moving on to our final wide receiver in the top 24, it is DeVonta Smith, wide receiver from Alabama. Of course, in his rookie year, he's had himself a lot of inconsistencies. Now, of course, the quarterback position and the way that this team has ran the ball as of late has kind of lent to the idea that Jalen Hurts doesn't have to throw the ball every time, especially when there's coverage sacks coming in his direction, when the secondary has played well enough to force him out of the pocket. This man is not afraid of running. He's not going to force the ball down the field. He will make plays on a consistent basis. And luckily last week, DeVonta Smith was able to get himself 5 catches, 80 yards, and a touchdown. But going into this weekend's matchup against Washington, one that he took on a couple weeks ago, in which, the Philadelphia Eagles, they ran for 200 yards from their respective running backs, and they had Dallas Goedert do the rest offensively via the receiving game. Of course, Greg Ward also scored a touchdown, so there's always a possibility in which we could see the receiving core of the Philadelphia Eagles take advantage of the Washington football team matchup that are giving up the 8 points to opposing wide receivers. I mean, the last time they took them on, 10 receptions, 139 yards, and a touchdown. That was the accumulated stats from the wide receivers for the Philadelphia Eagles. But just recently, this last week, Washington got exposed once again. 18 receptions, 296 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns from Dallas Cowboys wide receivers, where there was the first string, the second string, it didn't matter. They could not stop a soul. If the Washington football team cannot fix their mistakes, I think DeVonta Smith could have himself a fantastic week here. Moving on, we have Russell Gage as our number 25 overall wide receiver. Now, Russell Gage has been a very consistent wide receiver, and that is why he is in this conversation. In the last 5 weeks, he has had 8.4 targets per game, 6.6 receptions, 77 receiving yards, and 0.4 receiving touchdowns per game. That's 12.62 fantasy points per game. And I understand he takes on the Buffalo Bills secondary, and that is one of the tougher matchups at the position. But if he is going to be the only receiving option here, that is a viable one. The fact that Cordero Patterson has been extremely inconsistent. The Buffalo Bills are one of the better defenses in terms of stopping opposing tight ends. That eliminates Kyle Pitts as an option. The outside wide receivers, they're going to get locked up, and that only leaves Russell Gage to be the best overall option for Matt Ryan to send the ball in his direction. I think we've seen it earlier this season, especially in the last 5 weeks. When they have tougher matchups, Matt Ryan is not shying away from the idea of throwing the ball to Russell Gage 10 plus times. And if that's going to be the case, by all means, he's an incredible play half PPR and definitely in a full. Moving on to KJ Osborn at number 26. I mentioned it earlier with Justin Jefferson. With Adam Thielen having a season-ending surgery because of his ankle injury that he has sustained over the last couple weeks, it does continue to give more opportunity to KJ Osborn to take the next step in this offense. And he really has. He's taken a lot of, steps forward here, and he's done the most with his opportunities. In fact, in the last 4 games, this man has scored 3 receiving touchdowns. As long as the ball is going in his direction, he will continue to succeed. We saw it last week. 5 catches, 68, and a touchdown, 15.3 fantasy points. He has the ability to play in the inside, the outside, be a deep threat. Doesn't matter. You can use him all over the field. He is a fantastic receiving option for this offense. And as long as we continue to see the Minnesota Vikings and Green Bay Packers continue to have high-scoring matchups against one another, KJ Osborn should be a great play. Moving on to Christian Kirk, taking on the Dallas Cowboys. We all know that the Dallas Cowboys are a defense that give up yards. They're a bend but don't break kind of defense, and that's what I expect to see. But luckily for Christian Kirk, there is no DeAndre Hopkins. Rondale Moore's dealing with an injury. There's a possibility, because of James Conner being a game-time decision, he is not going to be in this offense, which will open up to opportunity to get Christian Kirk the ball, which is exactly what this team has done. In the last 2 weeks, he has had 21 total targets. That kind of opportunity cannot be overlooked. As long as he is getting the attention of Kyler Murray going in his way, those opportunities, those receptions, those yards, they'll continue to light up a defense, especially like the Dallas Cowboys, who have given up so many receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. Moving on to Brandin Aiyuk. Look, he's been pretty inconsistent. But with that said, he's had 3 touchdowns in the last 5 weeks. When you're able to score as much as he has, that will give us a little bit more confidence in the idea of starting him, because at least he'll be able to, get his performance with a 6-point influx, perhaps maybe, regardless of who the quarterback is, and get us into the conversation of at least being, a top 30 wide receiver. And that's what we're hoping the case is going to be. So Brandin Aiyuk right now taking on the Houston Texans. It is an easy matchup, but understand that Brandin Aiyuk is an extremely inconsistent wide receiver. And with only 5 targets this last week, 4 catches for 40 yards, it wasn't a guarantee that he was going to have himself that kind of a performance. And if he's not able, and he's just shy of scoring a touchdown, we could be in a little bit of trouble. But that's just the entire conversation behind an offense that has a established running game, established wide receiver option like Deebo, and Kittle always feasting. Moving on, we have Jarvis Landry as our number 29. Jarvis Landry takes on the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think Jarvis is incredible. I mean, in the last 4 games that he has played, he has had 35 total targets. Now, the question is, can he go ahead and continue to step forward? Of course, the wide receiver options like Rashard Higgins, Donovan Peoples-Jones, they're going to make the big plays. But what Baker Mayfield in this offense just needs is to get first downs, continue to trickle down the field, and just feed the ball to Jarvis Landry. He is a playmaker, and as long as he continues to have opportunity, I think he's going to be in a fantastic position. If you're able to get yourself about 8 targets per game over the last month of the season, I think a touchdown is just around the corner. Of course, we've seen him have great performances against this defense, specifically if we go back to the NFL playoffs last season. In that first round, the wild card weekend, he definitely put a quick number on this defense. Hopefully, he'll be able to do something similar this week. Moving on to Tyler Boyd at number 30. I can't avoid, putting Tyler Boyd on this list anymore. He has been insane. Yes, he takes on the Kansas City Chiefs, but in terms of fantasy points, since week 13, this man is averaging 13.35 fantasy points per game, which again is a notable fantasy point total. Yes, I think he's rostered about like 66 to 70% of leagues right now. But the thing that we have to take into account is that the last 2 performances that he's put forth have been on the backs of a 55-yard receiving touchdown and a 68-yard receiving touchdown. If he doesn't have those huge performances in which he's having one play define his entire week, then yes, Tyler Boyd isn't as safe of a play. But for right now, as long as he continues to have these opportunities go in his direction, Tyler Boyd is a playable option this week. Moving on. Elijah Moore on number 31. If Elijah Moore is given the thumbs up this week, I am 100% starting him, maybe even as a top 24 wide receiver against Tampa Bay. The only unfortunate reality is that the coach for the New York Jets said that he has a 50-50 chance of playing. Of course, he's coming off of the injured reserve, and that does, deem it a little bit risky to go ahead and play a guy immediately off the injured reserve. But we did see last week A.J. Brown come off and light up the league. Again, let's not forget, Elijah Moore was one of the better wide receivers prior to his injury. He was averaging 15.15 fantasy points per game, and honestly was just dominating. He had scored 6 touchdowns in his last 7 games, and just what more could we ask for? He was putting together an unbelievable track record in which he was averaging like 5 catches per game, a receiving touchdown per game almost, and 67 receiving yards per game. As long as this man continues to be in that kind of conversation, continues to be the number 1 receiving option for this offense, I think he'll be in a good position. Moving on, Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Look, Valdes-Scantling is probably just going to benefit from the fact that as soon as Davante Adams is double covered or they get tired of throwing him the ball after he gets over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, they'll come back to Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Earlier this year against the Minnesota Vikings, he put up a pretty good game of 4 catches on 10 targets, 123 yards and a touchdown for 20.3 fantasy points. He is a deep threat. And of course, with Allen Lazard continuing to find himself success in this offense, that may affect the overall potential of Marquez Valdes-Scantling, but they're 2 different types of receivers. Marquez Valdes-Scantling is going to make plays over the top of a respective defense, and with Minnesota and how bad they have been in the secondary, I think he'll be able to do so. Moving on to Joshua Palmer. This pretty much is a placeholder for any wide receiver for the Los Angeles Chargers. In the last couple weeks, we have seen Los Angeles Chargers come out of the woodwork and produce insane numbers. In fact, in the last 3 games, Josh Palmer has scored 2 touchdowns. In the last 3 games in which Jalen Guyton has played, he has scored 3 touchdowns. Regardless of who the number 2 wide receiver is in this offense, maybe even Mike Williams, I think there's a lot of success to be had, even against the defense like the Denver Broncos, because Justin Herbert just continues to find a way to score with a variety of different receiving options. Moving on to our number 34, we have the Chicago Bears wide receiver Darnell Mooney. With the conversation of Allen Robinson most likely missing another week. He was on the virus IR list, said he lost 10 pounds and is not even close to being back to ready to play. Allen Robinson's pretty much done for the season. Darnell Mooney should be the number 1 option here, taking on the New York Giants, who are giving up the 12th most points to opposing wide receivers. I've mentioned it all season long. This team cannot stop opposing wide receivers. James Bradbury has played far less than we have seen in seasons past. This defense cannot stop opposing slot receivers, and hopefully we'll be able to get Darnell Mooney into that slot position with Jakeem Grant dealing with an injury. Of course, he's coming off a week in which he had 9 targets in an offense that I thought should have been a little bit better, but due to the weather with Nick Foles, wasn't able to allow Darnell Mooney to take that next step. Overall, I believe that with Justin Fields returning to the lineup, there's an even better opportunity for Mooney ahead. Moving on. Our next option is A.J. Green taking on the Dallas Cowboys. He's the second best receiving option in this offense. I understand he's inconsistent, but A.J. Green has to be respected because this Dallas Cowboys defense really does give up a bunch of yards. And as we all anticipate, it's most likely going to be a game in which Arizona's throwing and trying to get back into the contest, as they'll be losing to Dallas. So if that's going to be the case, A.J. Green is going to have to get himself a decent amount of yards in order to help this team compete. The final receiving option is Jakobi Meyers. I don't really like the matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, mainly because though the fact that Jakobi Meyers has had himself 20 targets in the last 2 games, and that Brandin Cooks had himself an incredible performance of 7 catches, 102 yards, and 2 touchdowns against the Jacksonville Jaguars a couple weeks ago, I can't really rely upon a New England Patriots wide receiver to have himself a great game. Jakobi Meyers doesn't score touchdowns. The only touchdown he's ever caught in his career was earlier this season with Brian Hoyer at quarterback in garbage time. Really, it's a matter of whether or not he's able to get over 100 yards and maybe a couple catches, 6 to 8, to establish himself a great performance. Outside of that, he's going to definitely be in that wide receiver 4 conversation. All right, these are our Week 17 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to subscribe, click the like button down below, and, of course, check out Underdog Fantasy for those of you who are trying to play in the Pick'ems matchup. Of course, pick 5 Pick'ems correct in a singular slip and 20 times your overall money. On top of that, the weekly contest, the Sunday Battle Royale, you can draft a team against 5 other opponents and play against thousands to establish your fantasy dominance across the entire landscape, or go ahead and draft best ball teams for the NFL playoffs that are ahead. There's a lot of those to take care of and a lot of prizes to win. Check that out. Use promo code ANGE today. Tomorrow, we'll talk about quarterbacks and tight ends. And until then, thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.